I invite you to remain standing for our scripture reading. We'll be reading from the Sermon on the Plain from Luke chapter 6. Let's read God's good word together. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you, and if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. How far are you willing to go to do good? Are you willing to step outside whenever the wind chills 2 degrees to help somebody out? I had to change a tire yesterday. It was not warm. Nobody stopped. In fairness, I was kind of tucked away in a corner, not high visibility. Also, do you know lug nut wrenches that come with your car? Mine was like this long, and my tires got put on by a mechanic that was using like a power wrench. I had to climb up and jump on that thing to actually get it. Anyway, it was a whole deal. Somebody hopefully was videoing it. You may see it on the internet later today. But are you willing to get out and help someone in the cold? Are you willing to suffer personally? Are you willing to go to jail? As we come into Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, we remember that, we remember a lot of things. Sometimes we focus just on some of the things that Dr. King said, some of his speeches, and that gets divorced from the way that he actually carried out his work, leading a campaign of nonviolent resistance, being willing to be hurt, to take beatings, to have fire hoses and dogs turned on you, and not to retaliate. And are we willing to live up to that kind of standard? That's a higher standard than most of us are willing to embody, to follow. And yet, it's something of the standard that we hear in Jesus' teaching. And this is actually what Dr. King says about the movement's inspiration. He says it was the Sermon on the Mount, rather than a doctrine of passive resistance, that initially inspired the Negroes of Montgomery to dignified social action. It was Jesus of Nazareth that stirred the Negroes to protest with the creative weapon of love. And what we see in that movement is the power of love. That's what we're going to talk about today. That's what we've been talking about these last few weeks as we have gone through our sermon series, Reckless Love, and looking at the love of Jesus that goes beyond what we would expect or imagine, of Jesus going into places, talking to people, interacting with them in ways that seem reckless. And yet that's the example that he sets, and that's the standard that he calls us to. And sometimes I kind of wish he had called us to a lower standard, right? And yet that's not what he invites us to. And so that's what we've been going through the last few weeks. And what it's based on is really the great commandment, what Jesus tells us is the most important thing. And whenever he was asked which commandment is the greatest, Jesus said, the first is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There's no other commandment greater than these. Probably you've heard that before. Many of you, I imagine, have heard that. Maybe you grew up with it. And here's the thing. Jesus binds those two things together. And what Pastor Mark taught us in the first week of the series is that loving God enables me to love my neighbor. And loving my neighbor enables me to love God. Those aren't two separate things, right? It's not, well, you do one of these really well, and then you're working on the other. It's like both of those go together. As we learn to love God better, we also love our neighbor better. And if we think we're loving God really well and loving our neighbor really poorly, then we need to check ourselves, right? If we're in worship and Bible study all the time and super hateful to other people, then Bible study's not working, right? It is time to change tactics. And so those two things cannot be divorced, because this is what we read about in the first letter of John. Beloved, let us love one another, because love is from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is what? God is love. And Jesus wants that for us in our lives as well. His goal for us is nothing less than the full transformation of your life into the loving nature of God. transforming your life into the loving nature of God. No big deal, right? Just a small tweak for most of us here, there. Transform your life into the loving nature of God. No, that's a really big deal, and yet that's what he wants us to. And he gives us the power to actually be able to do it. And what we saw last week is that as he invites us to follow these commandments, to live out this kind of love, is that the greatest commandment is not to love your neighbor more than yourself. It's to love your neighbor as yourself. We have to be able to love ourselves. We have to be able to receive love in order to give it. Otherwise, we'll never be able to because we don't feel like we're worthy. We'll be too insecure or worried, or we just won't have the strength to be able to do it. And so we need to be able to receive God's love, to love ourselves in order to be able to love our neighbors. And then we'll be able to love people that are outside of our circles, that are beyond the people we normally associate with. And that's what he invites us to, because when the people in our circles are only like us, we miss out on the growth and the beauty that God desires to share with us. There's an entire beautiful world of people who are really different, and often different in ways that drive us crazy. And yet those are the people that Jesus invites into our lives. He invited a tax collector and a zealot to be his followers and to live together. And the zealot would have wanted to kill the tax collector, but Jesus told them, you've got to figure it out. This is actually the way that you will become people of love. And so hopefully we don't have people in our inner circle who are trying to kill us, but that's the way that God invites us to experience that. It is sometimes those people that most drive us crazy are the people who are actually helping us receive the sanctifying grace of Christ. And so what Jesus is fundamentally teaching us is an orientation to love. And that's actually what he's giving to his disciples in the Sermon on the Plain. And so we read about Jesus calling the apostles last week, several of them, Peter and Matthew, the tax collector, and Simon the Zealot. And after selecting his 12 apostles, Jesus came down from a mountain to a crowd of people who were seeking healing. This is what Luke says. Jesus came down with them and stood on a level place with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coast of Tyre and Sidon. And so the language Luke uses is important. So it talks about the 12 who we normally call disciples. Luke usually refers to them as apostles, people who are sent. And then there's a bigger group, we're talking about concentric circles. There's a bigger group who are known as disciples. That's a larger than just the number of 12. Do you know who else that includes? Us. There we go. That's right. Maybe not an obvious leading question, but somebody got it. So, and then there's a great multitude. There are also people who are curious, who are checking this Jesus guy out, but aren't his disciples yet, have not decided to follow him. And so all of those who have come and they've gathered, they'd come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. And those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured. And all in the crowd were trying to touch him, for power came out from him and healed all of them. And so all these people had come, they had gathered, they were healing, they were helping him as he was healing the crowd. And then, this is what happens next, then he looks at his disciples and he began to teach. He said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom." And in doing so, began to give them kind of a 101, this is what it means to be my follower. You've been named apostles, you're part of the inner circle, the 12. Now we're going out and doing the work, and this is how we're going to do it. He began to address his disciples. And so this is specifically addressed to the people who have decided to follow him, this is not teaching for the crowd necessarily, but it is specifically for those people who've decided to follow him. This is what Bishop Tom Berlin says. He says, the Sermon on the Plain, which this is part of, is an orientation lecture from the rabbi to his disciples on the nature of God's love that they are expected to exhibit. It's kind of like syllabus day whenever you go to college. Like, here is what is expected if you're going to be part of this class. If you're going to be my apprentice, this is what the expectations are. And in his sermon, Jesus describes what a life transformed by God's love looks like. And this is the picture that he paints. He says, "I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who abuse you." So no big deal, right? Like, let's get all of the easy stuff out of the way, and then we'll get into the really hard parts of loving, right? I mean, all those things super easy. Anyone doing that really well? No, we're not quite there. Okay. So what he starts with, we'll kind of go through it. He starts with a key principle, and that is love your enemies. That's the key. Now, I think Jesus missed the part where enemies are not like, that's not what enemies are for, right? How are you supposed to treat enemies? You're supposed to hate them, right? You're supposed to get them before they get you. And yet here Jesus is telling them, like, he doesn't even soft pedal it. He's like, here's the deal. Who are you supposed to love? Your enemies. And so he lays out this principle, and then what he goes on to do is expound on it. And so he restates the principle in a couple of different ways. In case you missed it, like in case loving your enemies just didn't register, he said, do good to those who what? Hate you. Bless those who pray for those who. Is any of that easy? None of that is easy, and none of that comes naturally. And yet that is the standard that he's setting, is that we are going to love in a way that does not make sense. I mean, if any of Jesus' teaching sounds reckless, it's this, right? Like, I can't love my enemies. They're out to get me. They're going to take advantage of me. I can't do good to those who hate me. They're just going to continue to take from me. I can't bless people who curse me. That's going to really put a damper on my day. And pray for those who mistreat me. I'll pray for them to stop. But I don't want to pray for them. Why would I pray for them? They're hurting me. They're making my life miserable. These are not things that come naturally to us, right? Unless you're a superhuman. And so he lays out this principle. He kind of describes it in different ways. This is what that looks like. And then he applies it to a few different situations. And this is what he says. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. Now, I don't know about you. Did anybody here have brothers? I have 2 brothers and a sister. She's the youngest. But I don't know if you knew this. Maybe it's not this way. I have girls. But at least in the 90s, brothers hit each other a lot, right? Does that match anyone else's experience? And the thing that you do in response, you've got basically 2 responses that work. One of those is hitting back, right? You got to get them back. The other one is running to mom before you get hit again. Right? And so if you're smaller, that one's more effective, probably. I don't know. But and so those are the kind of the 2 things. And here's the thing, Jesus had brothers. Like, he knew. Do you think Jesus ever got hit by his brothers? I mean, I'm guessing he was probably not the instigator, but come on. Like, if he had brothers, they hit him sometimes, and he had to respond to that. Did you ever think about that? Like, what was it like in Jesus? Anyway, okay. But if someone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. That is not what you do. Certainly that's not what you do if you have brothers, because if your brothers are like mine, they would take full advantage. Like, okay, thanks, a free one, here we go. But that's what Jesus says. That's what loving your enemies looks like. Offer the other cheek. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Probably that does not apply in weather like this, that you might die. But that's the standard. If they're taking from you, then give them even more than they've already taken. Give to everyone who begs from you. Notice he doesn't say, like, give to the people that you personally have found deserving after going through a careful consideration. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. And here's kind of the summary. Do to others as you would have them do to you. So we read through all of these things, and these are the things, like in Bible studies that I've led as we've kind of gone through this, these are the things that you get hung up on. And you're like, okay, but if somebody hits me in this situation, do I also have to offer my cheek? And let me figure out the reasons why this is a hyperbolic teaching and not something that I have to actually apply. And it's really right, I mean, because this standard is super high. And we think, like, if I have to give everyone who asks of me, like, every time I go through an intersection, I'm going to have to give to people, and then I'm not going to have any money anymore. And I don't know what exactly the reality of that is. But these are really hard things for us to think about following. And one thing that's helpful, I think, and I'm not going to make this easy. There's not a way to you can make it easy, but you're lying to yourself if you do. Anyway, that's just how it is. But one thing that helps is recognizing that when Jesus gives these instructions, he's not making new laws. Like, these are the specific things you have to do, right? That covers like four situations in human life that you come up against, like, not terribly often. Maybe you get asked for things a lot, particularly if you have little ones running around. But these other ones, so he's not making laws. What he's actually doing is describing what someone who has this kind of love will look like. This is how this kind of person will respond in these kinds of situations. Dallas Willard describes it this way. He says, all has changed when we realize that these are illustrations of what a certain kind of person, the kingdom person, will characteristically do in such situations. This is how God does it, and he invites us to join him. And so Jesus is painting a picture of if you are a person who's transformed by my love, if you are the kind of person who loves their enemies, this is how you might respond in these kinds of situations. And so he's setting this painting this picture. Now that doesn't mean like he's just like throwing out examples and you don't have to do those things, right? I'm not saying that, but he's painting a picture of what it looks like to be the kind of person who embodies the love that he embodies. And he sets this standard that seems impossibly high, right? Like, how am I going to do that? I have a finite number of shirts. Like, if I keep giving my shirt away, for one, like, I might get arrested. That seems like if I'm wearing it, and he's not clear if that's like one that's in your closet. Hopefully that's what he meant. But we come up with all these things because the standard seems too high. And yet that's the standard of love. That's what love really looks like. That's the kind of love that Dr. King talked about as the inspiration and the power behind the civil rights movement. And he talks about that. If you've ever read his writings, you probably have heard him speak, seen videos of his sermons, but he's such a powerful writer too. And he talks about the New Testament word for love, agape. And this is what he said. He says, agape is not a weak, passive love. It is love in action. Agape is love seeking to preserve and create community, to create connections and relationships between people. It is insistence on community even when one seeks to break it. Agape is a willingness to go to any length to restore community. And that's the kind of love that Jesus is talking about, that's willing to go to any length to restore community, to restore relationships between people, even not retaliating whenever someone hits you, even giving away your stuff whenever people take it, giving them even more, even giving to people who ask you for stuff who have no claim on you, but just need help. That's what that looks like. And whenever we look at what Dr. King and his followers did, we see an example of this love. And it's something that they actually did. That people would actually walk in to protest knowing that they were going to get beaten, that they were going to get sprayed with fire hoses, attacked by police dogs, that they were going to get arrested and thrown into jail, and they were willing to do that anyway. And it's not something that's easy to do that and decide you're not going to fight back, right? I mean, you can imagine what that would be like. And so what it actually took was significant commitment and practice. And so one of the things that whenever they were doing work in Birmingham, they would have people go through these 10 commandments of nonviolence and keep them. And so just to read some of them, meditate daily on the teachings and life of Jesus, to inform as the foundation of what you're able to do. Remember that the nonviolent movement in Birmingham seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory, right? It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about beating someone else. It was about justice for all and reconciliation between all people. Walk and talk in the manner of love, for God is love. Pray daily to be used by God in order that all men, all people, might be free, and sacrifice personal wishes in order that all men might be free. I mean, that's some good stuff. And so they were committed to that. And then that wasn't just like something that they read and said, okay, I'll do this, or signed a piece of paper, and then that was it. They would actually practice enduring the kind of things that they were going to have to endure. And so you can see that they would prepare for sit-ins by actually having people blow smoke in their face, because that's the kind of thing that would happen at sit-ins, is they would just debase people in any way that they could. They would practice having water splashed on them, having their things knocked over, having more smoke. You can see the man has his tie thrown on his head, and going through all of these kind of things, having cigarette ashes dumped on them. There were even situations where they would practice getting punched and not responding. And so all of these things they did so that whenever the time came, they would be able to not retaliate. They would be able to endure things like that. And having dogs attack them. They knew these were the things that were going to happen, and yet they continued to show up to march because they embodied a love that was greater than the power of hate. They were powered by a love that was greater than all of those other things. It was a love that was beyond self-interest. It was for the good of all that they were able to do those things through a supportive community and through the power of love. Because Jesus' standard of love goes far beyond self-interest, and he even continues to talk about that. He says it this way. He says, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. He's not putting down sinners. He's just saying, look, you don't even have to know God to be able to love people who love you. Like, that's just what people do. That's how we're wired. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again, right? That is just a good business, right? To lend to someone who can pay you back, like big deal. And so what Jesus is saying basically is like doing good for people who can pay you back or who would normally or who will benefit you in some way. That's good, but it's not an accomplishment, right? That's just smart. It's just smart. Take care of people and they'll take care of you back, right? Take care of the people who are in your circles and they'll take care of you back. And what Jesus is teaching us, though, is that love is greater than those things. Love is not transactional. And so often, so many of our relationships are transactional. It's just a transaction, right? I do this for you. You did this for me. There's no love in that. There's just an exchange of goods, right? And I mean, there are times whenever that's called for. I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Whenever I go to buy something, I was at Home Depot yesterday, and the checker I gave them money, they gave me the stuff that I needed, and you know that was fine. But there was no love there. There was no relationship. Sometimes it's worse than that, though. Sometimes it's really we're trying to manipulate someone in order to get what we want. And it just becomes a transaction. I'm entering into this relationship because of what I'll get out of it. So many of us have so many relationships like that. I kind of think this is what Paul's talking about whenever he says in Romans 12, he says, let love be genuine. Let love be genuine, not motivated by self-interest, but by the good of the other. So he continues, hate what is evil, hold fast to what is good, love one another with mutual affection, outdo one another in showing honor. Not because you want to get something out of them, but because you genuinely care about their good. Because we can't really love someone if we only want to get something from them. That's not love. That's just manipulation. Or maybe it's a mutual exchange of goods. You know, it doesn't have to be bad, but I think about this. Do you ever think about if you won the lottery? Like, what would you buy? I was thinking about it, I was like, who are all of the people who would show up and expect something? And how would I respond? I don't play the lottery, though, so I'm safe. But you know, you wonder, because that would be a situation where suddenly you've got a lot more than you thought you had, and people will tell you that they are your friends and try to get something from you. And that's a gross version of that, but we have relationships that are like that on just a different level. But that's not love. That's not love. Again, this is what Dr. King says. He says agape, love, begins by loving others for whose sake? For their sakes. It is an entirely neighbor-regarding concern for others, which discovers the neighbor in every man or woman it meets. Therefore, agape makes no distinction between friends and enemies. It is directed toward both. Who does that sound like? Jesus, the one who said, love your enemies. He also goes on to tell a story of, later on in the Gospel of Luke, of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan's not good because he pulled over and helped someone who is in need, helped someone who had a flat tire, although I hear that's a great thing to do. The reason he's the Good Samaritan is because he was an enemy and still did good to someone else. That's the key. He was an enemy, but still showed love for the person in need. And so if we're going to show love like Jesus, we have to see in the other person someone that God loves, someone that we care for just because they're another human being. We have to see each other as a you and not as an it. As someone who is human in themselves and not just someone who can give me something, not just an object that I can receive something from. That's the language of Martin Buber, the great Jewish philosopher and theologian. And so we look at this standard, it seems impossibly high. And it is, without God's help in a loving community. We need the power of God to be able to love the way that Jesus calls us to love. And if we want to become that kind of person who loves this way, it's a journey, right? It's not something, Jesus is giving them the orientation, and from then on, the disciples got it right every time, right? Wrong. They did not. They got it wrong a lot. Actually, a surprising amount. You'd think like the gospel writers would make things a little bit better, right? Well, let's just leave out this story about Peter denying Jesus. Like, do we really want to say that about the guy that the church is founded upon? That's not great for our credibility. And yet they include that because that is honest. They don't figure it out immediately. But Jesus sets the standard and invites them to take the journey with him, to be able to embody that, to be able to embody the kind of love that he has for others. And one of the ways that John Mark Comer puts it, he's probably drawing on somebody else. I don't know who he's quoting, but he says, we are loved into people of love. As we experience the love of God, the love of Christ, the love of a supportive community, we become more and more people of love. We're able to take another step on the journey. And we may not be able to turn the other cheek quite yet, but maybe we can at least not hit back, right? That's at least a first step. Whenever our kids like, okay, you don't have to like kiss and make up immediately, but please just don't hit your little brother back. You're bigger than him. Don't do it, right? Am I the only one who's had that conversation? Okay, I didn't think so. But as we are loved into people of love, we become more and more able to love like Jesus. We take another step and we grow. And God helps to shape us and form us, and we're able to take another step and to where we can begin to embody the kind of love that we see in the people who are willing to endure the things that they did in order to set people free so that they might have rights that they've been denied by Dr. King and many others. That's what we're moving toward. And yet we all start somewhere. Most of us, I think, are not quite there yet, right? And here you go. Oh, you stole my coat? Great. Here's my shirt too. I'm not there yet. I'm like, if I don't chase after them, then that's a big step for me. But so we have to figure out, where do we start? We all start somewhere. Well, one of the places that we can begin is with one of the easier parts that he teaches us. We can start just by praying for our enemies, right? Pray for them. And not pray that they would get what they deserve. That we leave that to God. But pray for their good. Pray genuinely for their good. And then forgo revenge. Don't seek revenge. Just let go. They've done wrong to me. I'm going to let it go. I would like to get them back. And that includes, I'm not just talking about not hitting back. Most of us grow out of that in adulthood. Not always, but most of us do. I'm also talking about like the passive-aggressive stuff. You know what I'm talking about. It was just the holidays. You experienced passive-aggressive. You were with your families. But we're also letting go of that stuff as well. Saying, this was hurtful. This made me really mad. I'm going to let it go. I'm not going to seek revenge. That doesn't mean you're going to put yourself in a situation to receive that again, necessarily. But it does mean letting go of revenge. And for some of you, you've got people who really are enemies, who really are seeking your harm. And that's really hard to do, but that's a place to start. There's some of you who are thinking of this, and you're like, I don't really have enemies, and maybe that's how you feel. Even if you don't have enemies, we do all have people that we resent, that we avoid, that we look down on, that we judge. You know, Jesus has stuff to say about judging, right? Judge not, lest ye be judged. But we've got all of those people. You may have a neighbor, and the only time that you spare a thought for them, like the only thought that you have of them is he ever going to cut his grass? Like, that is the only thing. And you just think like, and so really that all you have for them is mild, but it's essentially a form of contempt or judgment. And so it might just be like, I can start just by blessing him or simply by showing them kindness. And then we'll have some kind of interaction that is not lawn related, right? This may be a plea because I'm someone who's too cheap to hire someone, but also not consistent enough to keep my grass where it ought to be. And so if you live in my neighborhood, it could throw me some grace, I would appreciate it. But we start simply by blessing them, even in a small way. Even in a small way, doing something kind for someone who really irritates us. Don't tell them why you're doing something kind for them. Hey, I'm doing this because my pastor said I need to bless somebody who irritates me. That negates it. Doesn't count. But bless somebody who's hard for you to love. And so here are a few ways that I want to invite you, kind of specific ways to live this out with me as we try to follow this really hard teaching this week. Is to commit to praying daily for an enemy or somebody you find hard to love. Decide, I'm going to pray for them every day this week and see if God doesn't change your heart about them. And that doesn't mean you're going to become best friends or even friends, but it will change the way that you see them whenever you take the time to bless them. And then there are a lot of people who we may not consider enemies. We may not even consider them at all. There are a lot of people who are really lonely. That's a lot of us at sometimes too. Most of us are lonelier than we were a few decades ago. And so just take an interest in someone that you typically ignore. You know, you might, if you find yourself where you're in a waiting room, strike up a conversation. And this one might be hard for some of you, particularly if you're introverts, but if you're on a plane, talk to the person next to you. I know. Some of you are like, why would anybody not do that? I can't imagine. I don't know. Some of us are weird. But just take an interest in people. You've maybe read there are studies that have been done by people in Chicago who take the train and like nobody talks to each other, right? I mean, public transportation, people don't talk, they're on their phones. And people imagine that if they did that it would be really poorly received, that people would not be interested and they would not enjoy the experience. And what studies have shown is that people who actually engage with their neighbors are glad they did. And it goes much better than they expect. And so one of the ways that we can bless people is just by having a conversation with them, particularly if there's someone who you know is lonely. Reach out to them and just take an interest. You don't have to become best friends, but take an interest. And then in case those two are a little bit too vague, like I'm going to get really specific. This is going to be so hard for some of you. When an inconsiderate driver makes you mad, speak a blessing over them. Speak a blessing. May God get you safely to where you're going. Something like that. Actually practice orienting yourself to love. Not may God get you to wherever you're going that you're apparently in such a big hurry that you're going to leave that part out. Speak a blessing. Actually practice being a person of blessing. And it changes your heart. They will not hear you. If they do hear you, you're probably doing it wrong, like you're yelling. But just that act is one step on the journey of love that helps God, that allows God to use us to become more and more people of love so that we're able to do the kind of things that Jesus tells us, the kind of things that we see in the example of the civil rights movement, people who are willing to sacrifice even their bodies for love, for the good of all, for a transformed world. Let's pray together. God, I thank you for the people that you've given us who set an impossibly high standard for love, and that they show us that it's really possible. And so, God, whenever we're tempted to make excuses, whenever we're tempted to be in denial or just to avoid, that you would help us to try to love others as you love us, as Jesus loves us. Because that is how you transform the world, through the people of your family living in love. We thank you that Jesus taught us how to do this, and that he holds us to such a high standard, and yet that he also modeled it himself, even asking the forgiveness of those who were killing him. God, help us to know and to embody that kind of love. We thank you for Jesus' life, for his teaching. We thank you that he taught us even how to pray, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.